But I think we recognise in the Uluru statement some kind of threshold. I would certainly hope that it is, and Dean will speak to us about that. There is, I think, a mood in the country, I hope it's more than a mood, of saying, look, enough is enough, really. When you know the facts, and I'm not going to regale you with facts that you know already, but when you know the facts of the injustices done to the First Nations people, they are truly shocking, as we all know. But there's been an anaesthetisation of consciences, I think, over time, that is connected to that denial of humanity, which alone can make these kind of colossal injustices even thinkable, let alone doable. So, and it's not as if it's all behind us either, because when you know some of the facts of, shall we call it, indigenous disadvantage around the nation, it remains as shocking as anything in the past. So enough really is enough. And for us as the church, the challenge is to find a word and a way of acting that is our word and our way. We're not politicians, we're not activists, we're not lobbyists. Anything we do or say may have political or activist or even lobbyist implications, but that's not what we are. We've got to find our word and our way, which is why we gather for this moment of endorsement here at Santa Teresa. It's holy ground, but also looking out across the water to Stradbroke Island, Minjerribah. So there are all kinds of reasons why it is important for the church at this time to endorse the Uluru Statement. And I say this on the eve of the first assembly of the Plenary Council, which is again a threshold moment in the life of the church, the journey of the church in this country at this time. I am pretty well certain that this question of a new engagement with First Nations peoples will come up. And that will involve, I think, consideration of truth-telling, because I do think that's, as the Uluru Statement says, that's at the heart of it all. We've never really told the truth. And the power of telling the truth, I think, was seen in a place like South Africa in its own particular way, and I think has to be seen here. It will be profoundly discomforting, but that's what has to happen if we're to find a new way, not just repeating the mistakes of the past and going round and round and round in circles, because that's the risk. There's been a lot of that in Australia. So this moment in its own humble way is important for the nation and for the church in this nation. And this whole call to reconciliation, I think, is far, far more central to the life of the nation and the church in Australia than it may appear to be. That we are talking about a running sore at the heart of the nation. And we are also talking about a running sore in some ways at the heart of a church that proclaims a gospel of reconciliation but has really struggled with the First Nations peoples. So you're not here to listen to me, you've listened to me already. You're really here to listen to the man on my right who knows more of all this stuff than I will ever know, because Dean is from the Quandamuka people and happens to be, he is the son of Evelyn, of course, as everyone knows. But
that's my claim to fame.
That's one of his many claims to fame, actually. Now, so Dean is he resides on Stradbroke Island, and it's a really good thing that we have him with us here today. Dean is the I mean, I have his CV here. I'm not going to read it all because it's just so outstanding and brilliant. But he said to me before that his professional background is a bit of a mixed bag, I think, didn't you say?
Yeah, very mixed.
Here, there and everywhere. Spent years in London. Has been an investment analyst. That's why he looks so prosperous. And he's got so many trophies in his cupboard, I can't even count them here. But more importantly for our purposes, he is the national leader of the campaign associated with the Statement from the Heart. And so he brings all the mixed bag of his own background and also his indigenous identity to that role. So I think that's enough by way. You can introduce yourself if there's something I didn't say that you think has to be said. So I'm going to be, I said to Dean before, well, I'll be Kerry O'Brien and you can be Paul Keating. So we're going to do a relay with the microphone, and I'm going to throw a few curlies at him and just see what Dean has to share with us as someone who has been so intimately part of shaping the Uluru Statement and also leading the campaign in the wake of the statement itself, because it presents a massive task. At 3 points: voice, treaty and truth. So now, Dean, many challenges, and this is a platitude, many challenges are facing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as we all know. So why is a constitutionally guaranteed voice considered to be important? Because there are some who say, it doesn't have to be constitutionally guaranteed, but the statement insists upon it, and I know you do. So just talk to us about that. Why is a constitutionally guaranteed voice so important?
Thank you very much, Bishop Mark. Before I answer that question, I just wanted to acknowledge Josh's very warm welcome to country, and it's wonderful to be here on my own country to talk to you as well, with my family here, my mum and my dad, and uncles and aunties that are here. So it's just wonderful to be here, and thank you very much for the opportunity, and very deeply appreciate the Church's support on this campaign that we have for the Uluru Statement, and my particular campaign from the heart, the campaign that I'm the director of, is specifically focused on that first change from the Uluru Statement, the voice, the constitutionally enshrined voice. And so to your question, where did it come from? I think it's really important, and as you said, and you've said a couple of times today, and it's worth repeating again, that this isn't a new story. This is a very, very multi-generational story that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been talking about for many, many years, wrestling with this fundamental question of finding our rightful place in our own country. And it's taken many different forms over the years, but there has been a very strong theme around this question of Indigenous constitutional recognition. So the part about the constitutionally enshrined voice actually started with the question of how do we meaningfully recognise Indigenous peoples in the Constitution. You know, the current Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Linda Burney, wrote a report back in 1994, back in the old ATSIC days, called Rights, Recognition and Reform. And they talked about constitutional recognition then. And it wasn't until about 2007 that then Prime Minister John Howard, in the lead up to the 2007 election, and it's important to realise the political impetus for this movement that led to the Uluru Statement from the Heart started with Howard. And he said in 2007, within 18 months of the 2007 election, should he be re-elected, that he would hold a referendum to recognise Indigenous peoples in the Constitution. So
he got rolled.
And he got rolled. And that was the 2007 Kevin Rudd election. Labor backed up that commitment and said, we'll join you on that. 14 years on, we're still having this conversation. So there was a period of about 10 years of expert processes, parliamentary committees, expert panels, joint select committees, every man and their dog having their say on what the constitutional change should look like. And sort of at the back end of that process, they turn around and go, well, we probably should ask blackfellas what they think meaningful constitutional recognition would look like to them. So the Referendum Council was set up. There was a bunch of leaders involved in that, three in particular.
Was it set up by Labor, was it?
It was a bipartisan commitment.
Okay.
So it was set up in 2015. I'm losing track of Prime Ministers. I think it was...
Aren't we all?
I think it was originally set up... Certainly Bill Shorten was the leader of the opposition. I'm not sure if it was Turnbull or Abbott. Anyway, it was set up in a very bipartisan way. And they were tasked with answering this question. If we're going to do this, we're going to drag 16 million voting Australians to the polls on a referendum, a couple of $100 million bucks. What's going to be a meaningful change for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? And so they set up the Referendum Council. I was involved with them in co-facilitating. Arnie Pat Anderson, Professor Megan Davis, and Noel Pearson were the three key leaders, and I was involved in co-facilitating 12 regional dialogues around the country, listening to mob directly, standing at the front of the room, and I heard it all. The fors, the against, the differences of opinion, and there were many differences of opinion. It's important to recognise that, and it's still somewhat, there is still a difference of opinion, and that's okay and very normal. But I got to hear it all. So I got to hear directly from mob what was important to them. And yes, they were talking about constitutional recognition, but they were also saying we've got real problems in our communities. We've got real challenges facing, and they talked about young people so much. They talked about their young people. And I got the sense there's this very, very natural human condition for all of us, that one of the main motivators for all of us is that we want to make sure that the generation that comes after us has got it better than what we had it. That our legacy to them is better opportunity, better lives. And it was devastating to hear mob faced with a potential reality that their kids were going to have it worse than what they did. So when the Uluru Statement was drafted, and when the idea of a voice being the single option for constitutional change came up, it was a very, very pragmatically minded mob we are to say, if we're going to do this recognition thing, if we're going to finally meaningfully recognise Indigenous peoples in the Constitution, let's do it in a way that makes a practical difference in the lives of our people. Let's not put a form of poetry in the Constitution, some preamble or some other statement that really doesn't say all that much and tick the box and move on. Let's do something that makes a real change. So they said, let's have a voice. And we've been talking about representation, and there's been many versions of representation and advisory bodies in the past. They've all risen and fallen depending on the whims of the government of the day. Let's not do that again. Let's come up with a voice that has a constitutional guarantee so that when it does give advice to governments that they might not like, they can't just do away with it and abolish it. So to come back to your question, Bishop Mark, we know that there are these issues. You talked about incarceration. We've had truth-telling many times in our country. They're called royal commissions. We had one in 1991. Back then, the proportion of Indigenous people in the prison population was 14%, far outstripping our population of about 3%. 14%, it was considered a tragedy back then. 30 years on, we're about 30%. So we've had truth-telling, real truth-telling. Witnesses compelled, the full force of the law to tell the truth about what was happening to our people in incarceration. And it's the most comprehensive report. You still read it, and the things are still relevant today. The changes haven't been made. The current government policy to close the gap on incarceration just to get to zero, not special treatment, just to get to equality on incarceration, won't be achieved until the year 2093. So nobody here alive today will see, according to the current government policy, will see incarceration rates reaching equality. The only blackfella kids that will see that, they're about 5 years old. None of the current leaders, myself, my peers, it won't come in our lifetime. That's what the current situation is. So how do we get to the nub of it? We've got to bring our voices closer. We've got to say targets like that, policies like that are just not acceptable. They shouldn't be acceptable to anybody. And so let's bring those voices closer to where those decisions are made. Let's make sure that the mothers and the fathers, the uncles and the aunties that know how justice systems work or not work in their communities. Let's bring them closer to the politicians and the bureaucrats, because they know they can't solve these problems by themselves. It's only going to happen when our voices are there. So those other issues that are facing our communities, we absolutely need urgent attention. But just doing the same of what we've been doing is proven failure. We know that it's not going to work. So we have to have a structural reform, and that voice is that practical change that will provide the foundations to get us there. It's not a silver bullet. It won't be different straight away overnight. We're not going to wake up on the Sunday morning after the referendum and everything's going to be hunky-dory. But it will provide the foundation for us to really get to the number of these issues.
Okay. Just on the statement, it's a memorable statement for many reasons, but one of the more memorable bits of it, I thought, was when it says that Indigenous people aren't naturally bad people. You know, but they've been treated as if they are, that they're intrinsically bad. And it's not as if the Indigenous people don't love their children. And yet we've by taking children away, we've either said you don't love your child or you're incapable of raising your child. These are, you know, the absurd misperceptions that really do sit like a cancer. But now, back to the business of referendum. I don't have to tell you, Dean, that referenda in this country have a very, very chequered history. So, you know, you're young and buoyant and all that sort of thing. Why are you optimistic that this particular referendum, if it's to go through, has a real chance of success? Why wouldn't it just go under and end up being a gesture that produces little or nothing? Why are you hopeful, DP?
Yeah, I am hopeful, genuinely. I'm not doing this so I can be part of some sort of noble failure. That's not what any of us are about. I think we should remind the people that keep telling us and trying to talk us into failure. I see it. I see it in the conversations I have now over Zoom and Teams and that. You just see the sort of pitying look in their eyes. And it's the look that says, you poor bugger, you don't already know that you're beaten. And they're just wrong. They're factually wrong, and I'll tell you why. There are three key components that make me really optimistic, hopeful. The first thing is we've got to remember there's still bipartisanship on the question of Indigenous constitutional recognition. Both the Coalition and Labor took election commitments in 2019, the last election, that there would be a referendum on Indigenous constitutional recognition. Now, obviously, COVID's affected all of our lives in ways that we could never have imagined, and so it's understandable that something of the magnitude of bringing all Australians together to vote in a referendum, we can understand why that didn't happen this term. But that political commitment is there, and it's still open. And the Prime Minister hasn't ruled this out. Despite what you'll read in various newspapers, if you actually look at the statements, which I do, it'll be a government source, it'll be the Prime Minister's office or whatever it might be, say X, Y, Z. Listen to what the Prime Minister says. And the Prime Minister hasn't knocked this. So the door is still open. Labor has still got that commitment. So the first ingredient is that political bipartisanship. It's still there. And we're working as hard as we possibly can to keep that door open. Okay. The second thing is Minister Ken Wyatt has been working on the design of a voice, co-design of a voice, and there was an extensive consultation process that happened. Even though they didn't ask the question about constitutional recognition, 90% of the more than 2,500 public submissions said the voice must be guaranteed by the Constitution. So the people, when asked, every single time we are asked this question, we keep giving the same response. That's going to count. So that the public have said that the voice must be enshrined. Minister Wyatt's got the final report. We'll soon know what that voice will look like. So we'll have a structure. So we'll have, firstly, bipartisanship. Then we'll have an idea of what the voice is. And we can show everybody that there's nothing to fear, that it's a very practical and it's a very fair proposal. But lastly, and this is the one that gives me the most hope, politics design the public, the people. And working with some political strategists and pollsters, and when we kicked our campaign off for The Voice in March last year, we couldn't have picked the worst time to launch a campaign around constitutional recognition just as the global pandemic was kicking off, and people thinking about recessions and loss of business and health and lack of movement. But when we polled 3.5 years after the Uluru Statement, with no formal campaign structure, some political headwinds, the public, 49% of the public would have voted yes in a referendum on A Voice. 49%, about half. Interestingly, only 20% would have said they would have voted no. We keep getting told the public won't accept it. Too great a risk of failure. But the evidence, the data says 20%, and the rest are undecided. They don't know enough, they haven't made their mind up. But our research also showed that when they hear about The Voice, and this is where you come in, when they hear about it and are aware of it, they're more likely to vote yes. They go positive, not negative. So 49%. Mob, when asked the same question, we did a specific poll for Mob, 71% would have voted yes in a referendum. That was in March. We've just been on a bit of a fundraising push and got some funds to do another deep dive research in August. And we deliberately did it when Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane were all in hard lockdown, because we wanted to stress test the public opinion. We wanted to put it under pressure and say, well, 18 months on into a global pandemic, people still got those issues on their mind. People still telling us that this isn't important and that there are other bigger fish to fry. And the general public support has risen from 49% to 57%. And the no's have dropped 20 to 16%, and there's still that significant sort of 1/4 to 1/3 that are undecided. Mob have risen 71 to 80%. So this isn't going away. In fact, the support's growing. And you mentioned there's a bit of a vibe in the community, and there is other research that shows that there are two things that politicians around the world, and particularly in democracies, that elected officials are really thinking about, and it's care and competency. You've got to show that you can know what you're doing and that you care about people. And I think there is an empathy for our cause right now that hasn't always existed, and I think the people are recognising that. So this is an issue that's just not going away. Not only is it not going away, but it's getting greater support. So those three things are the reasons why I'm feeling very hopeful about our position right now.
Making me feel better already. No, that's good to hear, it really is. I do, as I've said to you, Dean, there is a vibe in the community. Well, it's more than a vibe, I think. There's something moving deep down, and I think it's in the church too. It's certainly in me. One of the things I'm intensely aware of is I started down south in Melbourne, and the indigenous presence there is virtually invisible. It's there, you just never see it. Then I moved north to Canberra, and it was much more visible there. And that was a real eye-opener. But then coming further north to Brisbane, it's far more visible. And it's been a bit of an awakening for me, frankly. But there is, all right, the trend is up in terms of percentage, and that's very encouraging. But if you had to name the single greatest barrier to the kind of success that you're looking to, what would it be?
Perceptions of perceptions. There's this great big assumption that the country will not accept this. It's just an assumption. I think it's based in an experience of what we've experienced in the past. And yeah, we've gone through some pretty awful moments where our mob, I mean, I'm not saying we've treated it always extremely well, but there have been some really nasty bursts of history where it's been particularly bad. And I think there are a lot of people that think that we're right in there right now. And sure, there's still racism in this country. Let's be really clear.
Yep.
There is. We can't duck or dodge that at all. That is absolutely true. But we've got to understand the proportion of it. It's loud, and we hear it, and we feel it, but it's small. It's not what the majority of people think and feel. It's not what the majority of Australians think and feel. And I think those that doubt us, those that give you the pitying look, those that tell us we should settle for less, that we should lower our ambition as if the position facing our people is something that we can be less ambitious about, as if we've got the luxury of time just to kind of muddle along the way that we're doing it. It's all based in this assumption that we just can't win. And that's wrong. It's factually wrong. And we're demonstrating that through our work and through our research. And you know, for those people that say Australia's like that, I'd like to pitch our version against it and say it's not perfect, but we can win this because the majority of people think it's time for a fair go for mob. It really is time for a fair go. That old Aussie idea of a fair go, it's starting to stir. It's starting to stir on this issue. The idea that we just need a practical change. We've had too much of the promises and the plans and all the rhetoric and the reporting about closing the gap and not seeing the outcome change on the ground. And people are sick of it. Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people are sick of it. And there's a sense that it's just time we do something that has a real change. So I just implore you, don't look to the media for your sense of where the Australian people sit on this issue, because they'll tell you a different story. Don't read the headlines because it's not actually what's happening. Have faith that inherently people think that we can do this, it's the right thing to do, it's the fair thing to do, and have a conviction around that. And when you're talking to other people and sharing why this is something that you support, hold that strong. Don't let them say, well, what about what they wrote in the newspaper, because it's not accurate. And so, yeah, perceptions are the biggest barrier, and the easiest thing that we can do is push that aside and have the conversation with people, because, as I said, what the data tells us is that the more that you talk, even if you talk to someone that's never heard of this before, the chances are they're likely to become a supporter. They're not going to be someone that really has a go against you. So you know, and I've had that, but just have some confidence that those conversations, come referendum time, come that Saturday in the next term of Parliament, when we have the referendum on a voice, it's going to pay dividends. So I implore you and encourage you to continue to have those conversations.
Okay. I'm just intrigued by what you said about the timeline. Are you confident that there will be or can be a referendum in the next term of Parliament? Is it as close as that?
Well, that'll be 16 years after the first commitment, so I think it's close enough. Yes, okay. I genuinely do. I genuinely do. Regardless of the outcome of the election obviously has to be held by May next year. By the time whoever wins the election forms government and sets their agenda for the next term, we think potentially sometime in 2023, mid-term of the next term of Parliament, is our window to strike. I'll say this on timing. There's two parts to this. There's two stages to success here. Obviously, I've imagined so many times that Saturday night in the war room when the polls come in and we get the sense of what's happened with the referendum. That's one thing, but the first challenge is to get there first. We have to have the referendum, and it is our considered analysis of the situation that our biggest risk is not having a referendum and losing, it's not getting there in the first place. So if you are thinking about supporting this, don't just wait until polling day on that Saturday in the next term of Parliament to rally the troops. We need the movement here. This is actually the critical time to get that agenda up, to get that referendum up. Obviously, we don't take anything for granted. 8 out of 44 referendums questions are the only, only 8 out of 44 questions have been successful. The last successful referendum was in 1977. However, the most successful referendum in history was one on 1967 on our issues. And I think there's a sense it's this generation's turn to do it.
Yeah, I think very much that this referendum, if and when it takes place, well, let's just say when.
When?
Okay, no ifs. It's a different kind of referendum. And the referenda, when you look at them historically, they weren't all of a piece either. But yeah, it's very significant that 67 was the most successful. And if when the referendum happens, and I hope it is 2023, then I think there's every likelihood of success. That said, if I could just comment upon a remark of yours about racism. I have grown increasingly convinced over the years that there's an endemic, kind of pandemic, if you like, racism in Australia. And it starts with the indigenous. You talked about perception. The way indigenous peoples are perceived, even at some deep instinctual, pre-rational point, that when you think of the perceptions of the black fella when the Europeans first settled here, they weren't human. They were kind of invisible, and they had an extraordinary ability just to melt into the bush. That was something that the Europeans noticed. That they could literally make themselves invisible, but they were invisible in other ways. And then they were irredeemably primitive, and they were totally resistant to all the great gifts of European civilization, so it was thought, and except the diseases, of course. And then that sense that they were a people who were really vanishing. They were a disappearing people in more ways than one. They were going out of business, and there were policies put in place to make sure that that happened. A kind of an assimilation, I suppose you'd call it. But it meant that they were a people who were disappearing. So why invest vast amounts of time, energy, let alone money, in a people who were disappearing? Do think that those perceptions linger in strange ways and surprising places. Now, so part of what we're talking about is to make the invisible visible, to make the unheard heard, and to give a bit of power to those who have been absolutely stripped of power. They're powerless. And that's got to stop, because in the end becomes a denial of humanity. Now, we are, as I've said, we are not a bunch of lobbyists or activists. We are gathered more or less as the church. So I guess I ask you, and as you're up to your neck in the secular maelstrom of this whole thing. That's what you're called to do and be at the moment. But looking at it with your fresh eye, how would you see the involvement of the Catholic community? I mean, we're a big minority. We mightn't have the social clout we once had, but we've still got a fair bit of soft power, and we've got presence. We're everywhere. So I'd be interested to hear from you, Dean. What do you think we can do? What's the best contribution as far as you can see? Now, you're not a bishop, at least not yet. So what's your view of things or sense of things? How might we, as the church, with all our peculiarities, but also our outreach, what might we contribute? What's the best thing we can do, or among the best things?
Yeah, I think there's two ways of thinking about it. There's the institution, and then there's the people.
Yep.
And obviously they're connected, because, well, people should be the institution doesn't always work out that way. I'm not casting aspersions, but yeah.
Yes, you are.
Maybe a little bit.
He is.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. So institutionally, statements like your own and coming from the position of yourself as a leader of the institution, of the community is really, really important. While there might be a significant minority in terms of the Catholic community, it's still influential. It's part of the problem for the indigenous community in terms of our minority status from a pure numbers is that we're also not influential in the formal power sense. And that soft power or that moral power, however you want to frame it, is something that might change over time, but the church certainly has it. And so and importantly, there are decision makers in other institutions such as parliaments and governments and in business and in other places that are convinced and are responsive to the Catholic Church. And so I think it's important that the church has a role in spending some of that political and moral capital on our cause, if I would put it that bluntly. Yeah. Too many, and this is definitely not a comment about the church by itself, but more generally, there are too many institutions and power structures that generate capital off Indigenous issues. They put a sticker up or they make some sort of statement and garner a great moral and ethical capital about seemingly backing blackfellow issues, and when we ask them to go and back us in action, they go missing. They're not there with us in that cause. So in ways that the church probably understands better itself, I'd ask you to think about the ways as an institution you can spend some capital on this issue. And I'm a campaign director. I'm hitting everybody up for money. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the moral and political capital that's there. That's the stuff that's really useful. Yeah. As people, there's a demographic issue here, a really important demographic issue. Our support, there's economic issues, there's education measures that we're understanding where our support lies, locations, all that sort of stuff. But age is a real factor. Our support is strongest with the youngest. And over the life course, it drops off. And I'm even just looking here with the people that are here. If we start winning this demographic, we really start making inroads into the high chances of us being successful here. So within the church itself, as individuals, as members of a congregation, as voters, as influencers within your own personal and social networks, the more that you can start having a conversation, especially across that older demographic, the more likely we are going to win. So I ask you to do that, to help us reach into your own communities and have that conversation. And even if you don't get agreement and support, just awareness of itself is something that can translate to support later on down the track.
Mm. Yeah, I agree that whole question of awareness is absolutely fundamental. And you can think you're aware, but you're not. I'd say that of myself. It struck me when we did the waterhole exercise. It's a waterhole, isn't it? Yeah. Anne, you were around. I mean, that was an amazing experience for me in the sense that it built an awareness that I didn't realise I lacked. So, you can have blind spots of all kinds without realising them. Just listening to you then, I was thinking, Dean, that one of the things the Catholic Church has done very well in this country, we've done a lot of things badly, but one thing we've done well, we would say, is education. Now, that was seen as a kind of liberation. And yet the models of education that we've offered haven't always suited Indigenous communities. And I think that's been the experience, particularly up in the Territory and the Kimberley, say. Now, you are obviously very highly educated. I mean, what is your... I mean, is education the way out, or is that a classically Western misperception of what, you know, of what liberation might look like in the case of Indigenous peoples? I'm just intrigued to hear what you've got to say about the place of education of Indigenous peoples in this whole process, given that it's so central, has been so central to the life of the Catholic Church in this country, not just the Catholic Church, either.
Yeah, interestingly, not on the question of educating Indigenous peoples, but I had a conversation yesterday, and I was asked the question, what is it that we can do as parents to educate our children about this particular issue? And I kind of had to scratch my head and say, mate, it's probably more likely going to be the other way around. It's actually probably going to be more likely that it's the kids that are educating the parents, because even since I was at school, the way that kids are taught these days on issues of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and history is far superior than what I experienced. Yes, education of better education for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is key, but realistically, that should just be a minimum requirement of being a citizen of this country. It shouldn't be a special measure. The fact that we're still talking about it points to the failure. So we should think about that. We should think very, very carefully about the way that education is done, because there have been, as you say, attempts to do that, and sometimes they've actually had worse outcomes. But I think the real education piece here is, so yes, basically just as a basic matter of decency and humanity, of course. But the bigger education is the non-Indigenous population. We can educate the 3% as much as we want, but if the 97% chooses to stay ignorant, then it's always going to be a bit of a difficult challenge for us. I don't think that's the case. I think we're getting more and more of that. But I think the responsibility for the knowledge and the change should be with everybody. But I think the 97% has a big role there. And you made a comment about my education. Yeah, I had great opportunity. My mum and dad provided me with an awesome opportunity to be formally educated. But most of my learnings happened since, and it's been using this and this more so than this. That's really allowed me to learn, and so and being curious and challenging our own assumptions, and not letting your ego get in the way. When somebody pulls you up and says, actually, that's not the right way to say that, or that's not the right way to think, just for a second saying it's not about me. It's not about me. It's about the other, and being in service of others is a really good place to start, particularly on our issues.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I have come to see too late in life, I wish I'd seen some of these things earlier, but life's not like that, is it? But that, as you say, and I'm one of the 97%, obviously, but we're the ones who've got to learn. And sometimes, people ask me, well, you talk about a new engagement of the church with First Nations peoples, and I do. And they say, well, where do you start? Well, and the only answer I can give is, you start first of all by listening. This is like the plenary council journey. And it's the hardest thing to learn in some ways, to really listen. Not just to put up with someone while they gabble on to them. And as you listen, to actually believe that I can learn, and that we can learn from the Indigenous peoples. I believe that. They have to learn from us, and that's your point about the 3%. We're going to teach you, and but you won't teach us anything. But in fact, that's, I think now, for me at least, is the key. And I think, in fact, I'm glimpsing, I wouldn't put it more strongly than that the church in Australia can in fact learn a huge amount of what it means to be the church in Australia. A genuinely enculturated church, not a transplant. So, to really learn to listen and to learn from those to whom we listen, I think is completely central. And it's not necessarily easy. It does take, you said get the ego out of the way. I completely agree with that. There can be a kind of corporate ego too, and a white supremacy and all that stuff. In other words, a kind of humility is part of it. And that's not the easiest thing to learn either. But just, I was given this morning by Anne Morgan this book called Unbreakable Rock, which is written by a bloke I was at school with and who turned out to be quite a well-known AFL footballer in Melbourne, but spent most of his life in the Northern Territory. A guy called Michael Bowden. Studied to be a priest when he first left school, I remember that, but didn't continue, but married and had a tribe of kids. One of his sons was a famous footballer too. Anyway, Bowden's, just before he died, he finished a doctoral thesis, and he spent most of his life working with indigenous communities in the Territory. He sent me a copy of his thesis just, I don't know, to read, I suppose, and I thought, oh, not another thing to read, and a blockbuster at that, great big thing. So I sat down to read bits of it just so I could reply, say, thanks, Mike, very much. Yeah, great work. But I became completely engrossed with it because what he was talking about was the convergence of indigenous and Catholic spiritualities, each listening to the other. And it just focused me on what I've said about listening and learning. Okay, now, that said, within the First Nations peoples, among the various groupings, and you're an incredibly diverse mob or set of mobs, and that's one of the misperceptions that they're all the same. Of course, they're not anything like it. Now, I've seen that map of Australia that shows all the different territories, and it's just a cosmos. Now, I know that there's not necessarily total agreement about the Uluru statement. Can you just reflect on that a bit? Is there a need to create a single voice, or is it a symphony of voices, polyphony? What do you think?
Firstly, on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, unfortunately, on this question, are always held to a different standard to the rest of the community. Any sense of a difference of opinion, I'm not saying this is what you said. This is just a more generic comment. Any sense of a difference of opinion. We've got parliaments that are wrestling with the 51 and the 49% of difference of opinion, and independence, and all of these different interest groups, and that is seen as a healthy part of a community. And we get 80%. What about the others? Well, I say that's normal. We're going to have mob. Let me just burst the bubble for everybody right now. There will be some mob that vote against this in a referendum, and that is normal and should be respected. It's just normal. It's just communities. So let us have our own different ideas and philosophies. Don't impose an artificial consensus. I can tell you when I was listening through the Uluru statement process, I heard the differences of opinion. Yep, people walked out. Yep, people disagreed. Yep, the majority stayed in the room and reached a historic consensus and asked the nation to join us. So, give us a go. And on that front, that difference of opinion, if we didn't have it's not a healthy function of any group to be in lockstep and groupthink and say the exact same thing. It's just not how it works. On the voice itself, we talk about a voice. What is it? It's going to be a body, an advisory body that sits outside the parliament. the idea of the third chamber, when it was pulled up as an argument against, it was never suggested in the first place. And there's two reasons why it wouldn't be a third chamber. One, we said the Parliament should be involved in designing this. There's no way politicians are going to design a third chamber. That's the first thing. It's technically not possible. And the second thing is Mob didn't want a third chamber. Two's enough, or as it turns out, Queensland is too many. So we didn't want it, and it's not possible. So yeah, that's not even really an argument. But the idea of voices, it's actually about bringing the key thing here is not about trying to speak with one voice. The key thing is giving voice to those that have been previously unheard. Yeah. And the one thing this voice must do, if nothing else, and this is my highest ambition for it, is that it brings those voices of the community, front line, grassroots, however you want to say, to the forefront. Subsidiarity. You guys invented the principle of giving voice and giving power to those that are most affected by the decisions. Bringing them. This can't just be about creating an institution that entrenches the existing established leadership. We're going to need them. We respect everything that they've done so far and continue to do. We need them there at the table, and we need to bring those people, health workers in Halls Creek, justice workers in Mount Druitt, the people on the streets, the people that know how these things actually work in the communities. They need to be at the table. It's not about them just sending representatives to represent their voices. They've got to be at the table. And that's when we're going to start seeing real changes. It's going to frighten the heck out of a few bureaucrats that are sitting there very comfortably at the moment. And no, I'm not even going to say sorry. It has to happen. Has to happen. So many voices, but given voice to those that have been ignored or deliberately and willfully unheard over the period of time.
What are you going to do when the campaign's all done and dusted? Going into politics, are we?
No, I'm going bush, and you won't see me again.
Yeah. Famous last words, yeah. Cynthia's winding me up here, as only Cynthia can, of course. This conversation could go on for a great deal longer, but time does not allow that. So, oh, I see. Is that here to much longer, or wind it up?
Here to cut it off. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wind it up. But before I do wind it up, I just want to say very sincerely thank you, Dean, for being with us and for sharing insight and facts and the kind of wisdom that someone with your experience alone can bring to bear on this crucial issue. So, Cynthia, what's next? Yes, am I going to read the endorsement? I think I will. Why don't you and I, Dean, come and just stand in front of this podium, because I can't do a formal endorsement sitting on an armchair.
No.
So we'll swap positions. I'll go on the right, you can go on the left. It's exceedingly hard to read in this light, at least for me, with my troubled eyes. So, as a voice that speaks for many voices, I now formally endorse the statement from the heart on behalf of the Archdiocese of Brisbane. Today we have had an opportunity to hear Dean's talk, his words on the Uluru statement from the heart. If we look at the situation in Australia, some Australians are still excluded, and first among these are our First Nations First Nations people have in many ways been turned into refugees in the land that they have called home for many thousands of years. The statement is a very important document that calls for leadership and discussion and reflection by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders. Our role is not to do things on behalf of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, but to listen to them, to learn from them, and to accompany them and support them to determine their own future. In 1967, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander were counted for the first time, and now they seek to be heard. In a movement of the Australian people as a whole for a better future for this nation. So as Archbishop, I call on all people of goodwill and good intention the journey of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples by endorsing the Uluru Statement from the Heart and putting it into action in every way possible. And may God, who has begun this good work in us and in many others, bring it to fulfilment. Amen.